We're live.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, April 20th through electronic participation, Zoom video conferencing, live via the Town of Cobourg YouTube channel. Are there any agenda additions, Deputy Mayor?
No, Your Worship, there are no additions this evening.
Thank you. That's good to hear. Are there any disclosure of pecuniary interests from members of council? Seeing none, I'd like to proceed to Mr. Larmer.
Yes, Your Worship. Under the agenda next, we have presentations. And for presentations, we have one. We have Oscar Poloni of KPMG regarding the Town of Cobourg Municipal Service Delivery Review. I'm just going to get into the meeting. Just give me 1 second.
Mr. Larmer, can you see me?
Yes, I can.
And you can hear me?
Yes, very okay.
Thank you very much. And are you able to see my screen?
No, I will fix that. 1 second.
Sorry, are you able to see my screen, Mr. Larmer?
Yes, we are now able to see your screen, Oscar.
Thank you. Your Worship, members of council, good evening. Thank you very much for allowing us the opportunity to be here today. My name is Oscar Poloni. I'm a partner with KPMG, and it's my pleasure and my privilege to be involved in the Town of Cobourg Service Delivery Review. The presentation that we have for council tonight is intended really to provide a bit of an overview of the project, what we're intending to do, what our expected outcomes are, and also to provide council with some perspective as to what their role will be in the project, including how they're going to interact with the KPMG team. So the scope of work and the terms of reference for the service review were established in an expression of interest that the town had submitted to the province of Ontario in connection with a request for funding under the Municipal Modernization Fund. And basically it established 4 objectives, if you will. The first was to develop an inventory of your services, as well as the reasons for why you actually deliver the services that you deliver and what your service levels are. I will say that municipal services are a lot more complicated than sometimes people will perceive. There's a lot of regulatory and legislative framework that goes into why you do things. There's a lot of enabling legislation that dictates how you deliver certain services. So the service inventory is a good way for the municipality to highlight what people actually get for their tax dollars. The second thing that we would like to do during the course of the service review is to develop performance metrics and benchmarking. And this would look at the effectiveness of the town in delivering your service. So are you actually delivering what you want to deliver at the levels that you want to deliver? And in a lot of respects, performance metrics will involve customer service levels as well. And we also look at benchmarking information, which is a financial analysis of financial indicators against other municipalities to get some sense as to the cost of service and how you fare compared to comparator municipalities. In some cases, this will be denominated on a cost per household perspective. In some cases, we'll look at other performance measures. The other thing that we'll do, Your Worship and Council, is for certain services that have a heavy involvement of user fees, if you will, we'll look at the cost recoveries through user fees versus the municipal tax levy to get some sense as to whether the degree of financing between those two sources is reflective of what other municipalities do. The third objective that we are looking to do, and this is really where the value comes in, is to look at potential opportunities. So these are opportunities for cost reductions, opportunities for operating efficiencies, If you have customer service enhancements, how do you mitigate your risk and look at alternate service delivery? So I will always say, Council, there is nothing so perfect it cannot be improved. This is the chance for us to look at your processes, to look at your services, and to say, based on all of the analysis, municipal best practice, financial benchmarking, what we see elsewhere, is there a chance for you to refine what you do to deliver better value for the services to your residents? And then the last point that we want to provide through this service review, and one of the objectives, and this is really critical, is how do you move this from a service review that's conducted by KPMG to actual implementation by the town? And one of the things that we are committed to is making sure that we have this done in time for the findings to be incorporated into the 2021 budget for the town. We are looking at a September deliverable date, so that way you can transition right to budget. And I will say, Council, it is not as simple as saying, here's the list, go put it in your budget. We obviously have to have a transformation framework. We have to look at change management, making sure that the process makes sense, because otherwise you run the risk of this report basically sitting on a shelf. So with respect to the project components, and we've alluded to them a little bit in the objectives, there's really 6 main deliverables that we're looking at. The first one is the development of an inventory of municipal services. Then we want to look at process mapping. And process mapping is looking at how you deliver a service to find efficiencies. There's the comparative analysis. We've also been requested by the town to undertake a resident survey. And this is our going out to the community to get some sense as to what they perceive with respect to municipal services. We do want to look at the opportunities and then our final reporting to council. So with respect to each of these, just a little bit of information, if you will. So the service inventory really is intended to give the reader a summary of what you do, why you do it, and what comes out of it. So we talk about the service detail, which is what does a service entail? So for example, building inspection. It involves consultation with potential builders. It involves the reviews of plan. It involves applications. It involves periodic inspections throughout the process. It involves a final occupancy permit. So all of these things are factored into a municipal service. We also talk about the public policy objective. And the reality, Council, is this. You don't deliver services because you want to. You don't deliver services because you have to. You deliver services because there is a valid public policy objective that you are seeking to achieve. So I talked about building inspection. The whole point around building inspection from a public policy perspective, people will say, is it's a protective service. You ensure that homes are being built up to the Ontario Building Code. And so because of that, they're safe for habitation. You're protecting the person who buys the home off of the developer to make sure that it's built in the appropriate standards. You're protecting the second person who buys the house from the first person because they can rest assured that the house was built according to code. So there's all these public policy objectives that dictate really why you do the service, and we think it's important to highlight those. We do look at the basis of delivery, and generally speaking, we consider there to be 4 reasons why municipalities deliver a service. Some services are mandatory, so fire protection, building services, planning applications, your municipal clerk, for example. These are all mandatory services that are legislated by regulation. You have no choice. You have to do these. Some services are essential, and an essential service is something that you have to do because of public safety or for the effective running of the corporation, but you really can't point to a piece of legislation that says thou shalt do this. There is no legislative requirement for municipalities to deliver water services in Ontario. And I have some municipalities that don't have water, don't have municipal water. They keep everybody on the wells. The reality is for a community of your size, with your economic base, your residential base, and your range of public services, notwithstanding the fact I can't find a legislative requirement for you to deliver water, it is an essential service. It's something that has to be provided. We look at your service level standard, and the service level standard is the level that you deliver services in comparison to everybody else. And the analogy that I will use sometimes, council, is are you delivering a Cadillac or are you delivering a Chevette? And so the question is what is a service level that is either mandated by the province or a service level that other municipalities your size have adopted? And are you consistent with that? Do you deliver a higher level of service or do you deliver a lower level of service? Because obviously you can change where your service level standards are. As I discussed, we look to financial benchmarking and performance indicators to give you some sense as to your effectiveness and efficiency in delivering municipal services. We then want to talk about who your clients are. And so we talk about direct clients and indirect clients. Direct clients being those people who actually physically receive the benefit. Indirect clients are those people who get a benefit through a secondary approach. So for example, municipal transit services. The direct clients are the people who actually ride the buses. The indirect clients are the businesses who ensure that their workforce can actually get to work on a consistent basis and a timely basis. And I can appreciate, given current circumstances, not exactly the best example, but that is a differentiation between direct and indirect clients. And oftentimes what happens is if you forget who your indirect clients are, you actually expose yourself to risk. We do talk about the service outputs, both from a type of activities and a units of delivery. So for example, you have a finance department. So in terms of service output, there's payments, there's tax billings, there's user fee billings, there's payroll processing, there's T4s. So we highlight the types of services that come out, and then we actually highlight the numbers. So how many checks do you cut? How many bills do you process? How many electronic fund transfers? Because what that does is it gives you a sense as to what you're actually getting for your tax dollars. So if you can imagine an arena, for example, we'll talk about how many hours of ice rental there is. If you talk about sports fields, we'll talk about how many hours of usage there are. We'll also talk about delivery models, and there's a number of different ways that municipalities can deliver services. You can do them through your own resources. You can contract them out to third parties. You could provide a service, instead of directly delivering it, you can provide a financial compensation to a volunteer association, for example. Or you could use volunteers yourself. Oftentimes when you look at fire services, there's the composite of volunteer fire services. And then the last thing that we do is we will go through your budget on a line-by-line basis to do what people will refer to as a line-by-line review that not only looks at the costs, but also looks at the full-time equivalent. So you get some sense from a resource allocation perspective, where is your money going and where are your people? And then what that allows you to do is to get some perspective as to which departments are consuming resources at what rate. So as an example, council, in the presentation, this is an example of a service profile that we would have done for the city of Peterborough. And this is not a municipal service that you provide because they are a consolidated municipal service manager. So they're responsible for delivering Ontario Works. This is the first of 3 pages. And what this really is intended to do, council, is just to give you some indication as to what these look like. So we talk about what the service entails. We talk about the service value or the public policy objective you're seeking to address. We talk about why you deliver the service. Down below in here, we talk about performance and benchmarking, but oftentimes from a service review perspective, the most important part is this graphic right here. And what this does is this is a matrix that along the vertical column tells you why you deliver a service. So I talked about mandatory and essential. There are some services that are traditional in nature, and these are things that you're not required to deliver by legislation. You're not required to deliver by virtue of public health and safety, but municipalities your size are really expected to do this for their residents. The best example I can give you are arenas. So that would be a traditional service. And then there's other programs that are purely discretionary in nature. You don't have to do them. You don't need to do them. Other municipalities don't do them, but you choose to do them yourselves anyway. And then here is where we do the service level standard, below standard, at standard, or above standard. And the reason why I suggest to you that this is probably the most important graphic is depending on where this red dot sits, you will have different opportunities. So by and large, what I would suggest is this. If the red dot is towards the right-hand side of this, you have a service that's considered to be above standard. And then the question then becomes one of, if you're looking to save money, could you reduce that service level so that you're moving away from that Cadillac version of a service towards something in the middle line? Similarly, if you're hanging around at the discretionary level, the question that we have for council is this a service that you actually have to be into, or as a means of reducing costs, could you eliminate the service? And so depending on where this dot falls will tell you where your options are. A couple of things, council, if I may. Just because a service is mandatory or essential doesn't mean you can't change how you deliver it. You do have to deliver planning services. You do have to deliver building services. Those are mandatory services. It still doesn't mean you can't change how you do it in order to achieve operational efficiencies and customer service enhancements. The second comment that I'm going to make is when it comes to reducing service levels and when it comes to eliminating services, this is very clearly within the domain of council. So what you will hear, council, when we present our results, we will phrase these as opportunities. We will not phrase these as recommendations, because when it comes to services and service levels, I want to be very clear, your worship and council calls the shots. And if council chooses to keep a service at above standard, if council chooses to keep a discretionary service, that's fine, because that's the will of council. I'm not particularly concerned with what your answer is. What I do want to do, though, is have the discussion with you. So, bit of an introduction into the service profiles. The other thing that we've talked about from an efficiency perspective is process mapping. And process mapping is a tool that's often used in continuous improvement strategies like Lean, for example, where they call it value stream mapping. And what process mapping does is it's intended to take how you deliver a service and break it into its individual components. And the purpose of this is that you could look at those individual components and say, is there anything in here that you can improve? And from an improvement perspective, there's generally 4 types of enhancements that we look for. The first one are process inefficiencies. And these are areas where you may be doing things manually, where you could be using technology. So for example, could you be implementing optical character recognition to avoid manual key punching of data? Is there duplication of work efforts where 2 people in the organization are doing the same thing? Are you doing work where you have limited value? So I did a project for a municipality once that had a number of landfill sites. And one of the landfill sites, because of geographic coverage, was generating about $7 a week in tipping fee revenue. And by the time you priced the accounting, when it took the time to do the invoicing and the journal entry, what you quickly discovered is that was costing about $300 of administrative time to book $7 of revenue. And so the question was, why don't you just stop charging the tipping fees? Because the cost of delivering the control was more than the actual revenue that you have. An extreme example, but that's the type of stuff that you look for. The second thing that we are looking for are areas of financial risks. And this is the potential where you have risk from an internal control perspective that exposes the municipality to financial loss. So very much similar to what auditors will do from an internal control testing perspective. We're just looking, for lack of a better term, council, to tighten up your systems, to tighten up your controls. The third opportunity where we look is with respect to customer service limitations. And this really is to say, do our processes reflect a municipality that's open for business? Or are there issues with respect to customer services? And if you'll indulge me, council, I would like to take you back to 1987 when I actually registered for university. And I stood in line at Laurentian University in Sudbury for an hour and a half at the registrar's office in order to register for the Commerce program. And they said, okay, you're registered. And I said, well, how much is it? And they said, well, we don't take the payment here. You have to go to the treasurer's office. And I said, can you tell me where that is? And they said, it's across the hall. So I went across the hall for an hour and a half, stood in line behind the same people I stood in line at the registrar's office. I paid, and I said, am I done? And they said, no, now you got to go show to the registrar that you paid. So I had to go back across the hallway and pay and stand in line again in order to hand my receipt. And I can see the laughing at the table, but I told this story in 2014 at a municipality, and people in the management group started to look at each other. And when people start to cross gazes, you know you've hit on something. And I said, tell me what happens. And they say, you come into the municipality and you stand in line to apply for a building permit at their front counter. And then you get out of that line and you go into a different line on the other side of the counter in order to pay your building permit. And then you get out of that line and you go back into the first line in order to demonstrate the building permit. And I said, well, why don't you just let the building department enter the payment into the accounting system? And finance says, well, we can't trust building services to enter payments into our system because they'll screw it up. And then I said to the people, well, why don't you just walk behind the counter from finance to show them that I paid? Your worship and members of council, no word of a lie. The answer I got was, that's not in my job description. And so from my perspective, that's a customer service limitation that we're looking to enhance. And I know it's not an operating efficiency, but what I would suggest to you is the concept of being open for business isn't necessarily a bad thing. The last thing that we look for is with respect to litigation risk. And these are holes in your processes that frankly could get you sued. So this is things around indemnification and waivers with respect to rental of parks and recreation facilities. This is issues with how you do procurement for major capital projects. And are you sure that you're covering all the gaps? Because if you have a bad procurement, you're exposed to a whole bunch of things. So we've highlighted below some of the services that we would like to go through. The reality is we're happy to do this across a bunch of services. And so we'll continue to work with your staff to see. But generally speaking, the big ones that we see are around your finance functions, building permits, planning applications, how you handle customer services requests with respect to public works, and how you deliver capital projects. And so to demonstrate what this looks like, this is an example of a process map that we did for a municipality that talks about how you receive payments inside a parks and recreation stream. So we break it down by step. Everywhere you see a dot with a color and a number, that's a potential opportunity for enhancement. And so through this process, what we hope to find are ways, quite frankly, to make your operations more efficient and quite frankly, to make your operations better. I talked earlier on with the service profile about how things and questions around services and service levels reside within the realm of council because it's a governance decision. I want to comment, council, that this is an operational decision. So these types of operational efficiencies and their implementation typically rest with your staff. So I want to talk about the comparative analysis as well. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we find is always helpful is to take a municipality and compare them to peers in order to get some sense as to how you stack up. And this is a little different than the slide that you have in your hard copy. I will apologize, council. There was a mix-up when we sent the information out. So what we had was we had the town of Tecumseh from Essex County listed with the information from the Township of Essex. And so we've revised that on this chart. So my apologies for any confusion we may have caused. When we look for municipal comparators, we're generally looking for municipalities that reside within the same type of governance model. So we're looking for lower tier municipalities inside a county. Because if I take a lower tier municipality inside a region, the allocation between the upper and the lower tiers are different. If I take a single tier municipality, there's a whole bunch of stuff that they would do that you don't do. We look for municipalities with comparable population levels, but frankly, comparable household levels, because the reality is this, is if you're picking up garbage on a street, it doesn't matter whether 5 people live in the house or 1 people live in the house, you're still stopping at the house. So we are looking for municipalities that have comparable household levels. We're also looking for municipalities that have comparable geographic areas. So what you will find is that Cobourg is, from a relative perspective, relatively compact in that your geographic area is about 22 square kilometers. That involves a different level of service delivery than a larger municipality that would cover 10 times the area. You predominantly urban area, you'd have other places that are rural areas with different service levels. You'd need to have bigger build out with respect to infrastructure around road maintenance. You get more economies of scale with respect to cost per lane kilometer for road because you have a bigger network. In addition, larger municipalities are oftentimes the product of amalgamation. And so what you will find is there's a whole bunch of legacy effects that continue to echo through. So they'll typically have more arenas. They'll typically have more fire stations. And the reason why they do that is because it's difficult to pull that legacy infrastructure out. But if you had to start those municipalities from fresh, you may not necessarily put your fire stations or your arenas where you put them now. So what you'll find is, for the sake of variety, there are 6 municipalities we would like you to compare with. I will say this, Council, there is no perfect comparator for Cobourg. What we would suggest, though, is some are better than others. And what you'll find is the 2 that are highlighted in yellow, we actually think are better comparators because of the geographic area. Now, that said, we want to do all 6 because what we find is that gives us enough variety to get some sense as to whether you're an outlier or whether you're consistent. For the sake of inclusion, we wanted to include 2 municipalities from your county as well. So we've picked Port Hope and we've picked Brighton. I will confess Brighton, from a comparative perspective, is actually a little small from the indicators, but the reality is it's the largest one that we have after Port Hope, so we wanted to throw it in anyways. And Council, the reason why I put this slide up and have this discussion is if you don't necessarily agree with these comparators, happy to have the conversation. If there's other municipalities that you would like us to include in the mix, happy to include it in the analysis as well. There are 444 municipalities in the province of Ontario, and depending on which ones I pick, I can make you look like the best run municipality, or I can make you look like the worst run municipality. So I want a reasonable basis to do this, and if Council has a preference, I'm here to serve. So we've talked about the residential survey, and this will be a confidential online survey to get their sense as to how happy are they with municipal services and delivery. The majority of questions will be that traditional 1 to 5, extremely happy, extremely disappointed, neutral. It's actually called the Likert scale for those that are interested in doing surveys. Other questions, however, will be open-ended, where we'll say, could you tell us the top 3 things? Can you tell us your perspectives on this? We are not necessarily going for a sample size. We want to open this up to the community as a whole and let them provide the response. If there's a lot of community interest, we'll have a large sample size. If there's limited community interest, we'll have a smaller sample size. And we'll make sure to talk about that in the perspective, but really it will be determined by resident interest. And then we'll talk about the opportunities. So our experience has demonstrated that you will have opportunities where you have a couple of different things. Where there's gaps that exist between your capabilities and the services and service levels that you offer, there's an opportunity to change. And what this may be is, it may be you need to enhance your efficiency to be able to increase your output. Maybe you're not meeting customer service expectations, or maybe quite frankly, you're not sufficiently staffed or resourced to deliver at the service level you want to. And this is where you could potentially change your service levels. Where we do the process mapping, where we find duplication and where we find efficiencies or inefficiencies, those are always opportunities to change. where you have latitude with respect to what you do. So I've talked about mandatory services, for example, versus discretionary services. You'll always have more latitude in a discretionary service than a mandatory service because you have freedom to move. And so where you have that latitude, you may have more opportunity. Similarly, where your staffing is variable and it's not interrelated with other functions, you'll have the potential to change your processes and to change your services. So for example, council, if your clerk, Mr. Larmer, just as an example, is not only your municipal clerk, but he's the head of HR and he's the head of information technology, I can't take a third of Mr. Larmer out of the system. But if I had 6 people that were performing those 3 roles, I'd have more latitude. Also, where you have the benchmarking analysis that indicates that you're an outlier, if you're clearly a higher cost provider of a service than the peer group, that tells us the what. What we then need to understand is the why. And once you understand the why, it can tell you, do you have an opportunity? Should you be looking at automation? Should you be looking at contracting out? Should you be looking at a service level reduction? And lastly, council, where the survey identifies areas for change, it behooves us on the part of your residents to be able to address those concerns. So this is where you'll typically find opportunities. They're informed by a lot of different things: the service profiles, municipal best practices, benchmarking, the process mapping. What I do want to say, council, is there's 2 schools of thought on how you deliver service reviews. Some reports will have a lot of opportunities. Admittedly, some are a little better than others. We have a tendency to have a smaller list of opportunities that are what we consider to be a little more practical in nature. And so because of that, what we actually think is there's 3 opportunities that need to be practical in nature. So the first one around practicality, I'll give you an example. Water treatment facilities often utilize a technology called SCADA. And what SCADA is it's a remote monitoring and control technologies that allow you to monitor and control wastewater treatment sites remotely. And so what that means is you can actually run a plant without having an operator in the plant. And what that allows you to do is to save staffing money. The reality, though, council, is if you don't have SCADA technology in place, that's not practical. So before we start to recommend stuff like that, we're going to actually check to say, can you actually do this? The second thing is that they need to be politically acceptable. And I will say, council, that in some cases there are services that municipal councils will say, this is off limits. I don't care what you tell me, Poloni, this isn't going to happen. And what you will find is that I'm not particularly interested in causing a whole lot of consternation in the community by putting a service on the table when it's very clear that council has said no. And we may flag these in the report as we've identified these, but for political consideration, we haven't carried these forward. But if you're telling us, I don't care what you say, Oscar, this is untouchable, then I'm not going to waste your time bringing stuff up that, quite frankly, is going to ratchet up a whole bunch of tension for no value. The last point that I want to make is things need to be validated. And what this means is, before we present an opportunity, we're actually going to do a little bit of a mini business case behind the scenes. Because what I want to make sure of is that there's actually a cost-benefit solution to doing what we recommend. So we're not going to recommend that you put in optical character recognition if your systems don't work. We're not going to suggest that you put in different approaches to monitoring arenas and ice plants if the technology isn't there, or if it costs $1 million to save 10 grand. And so there's a bunch of things that we're going to do behind to actually make sure that when we have an opportunity for you, it's been validated. Now, these are not going to be formal business cases. That's not in the scope. But I do want council to know that we're not just going to come up with a list of 120 stuff that we're going to throw up against the wall and see what sticks. I had a service review in my community, and if I haven't said it, council, I live in Sudbury. So cumulative snowfall on an annual basis, somewhere around 10 to 12 feet. Part of the service review said, well, in Southern Ontario, municipalities get their homeowners to shovel the snow on the sidewalks in front of their homes. That makes sense probably if you live further south than Sudbury, but when you get 12 feet of snow to shovel repeatedly 150 feet of sidewalk really isn't something that's practical, politically acceptable, or frankly validated. And these are the things that we're trying to avoid. So in terms of project timing, we are commencing work on the review, even under the current social distancing provisions. Truthfully, Council, we have a number of service reviews that are undergoing right now, and they work. We sent an information request to your staff. They'll provide us with documentation. We'll prepare the service profiles. We'll get working on the benchmark. All of that analysis is fine. At some point, we do want to be on the ground. So from a planning perspective, we are actually planning that the remote delivery of work will continue until the end of May. My hope is sooner, but I'm an optimistic guy to begin with. So we're planning on being on the ground at the end of June. As I've mentioned, we are planning to have everything done for the beginning of September so that you can then take our analysis and roll it into your 2021 budget. There are 4 presentations to council that are planned. This is the first one. We would like a second one to go sometime in May. If we can come down and have the presentation in person, we will. If you would like us to communicate by Zoom, happy to do that as well. I just think it's important from our perspective to keep you apprised of the progress of the review as we move forward. So in terms of our interactions, this is the initial presentation, really to bring council up to sort of insight into where we are with respect to the review. We do want to have individual interviews with each member of council. And we want to get your perspectives on the municipality. We want to get your perspectives on priorities. There's actually an interview guide that we're going to be circulating. And starting tomorrow morning, my administrative assistant is going to be reaching out to each of you to schedule those interviews. We will plan for an hour and a half. If we go longer, we go longer. If we go shorter, we go shorter. But it's a chance for us to have a discussion with council now that you've seen this presentation, to talk about the review, to talk about the town, to talk about the services, and really to get your perspectives on it. We do want to have the 2 interim reports. So sometime in May, sometime in June, and then we would like to come back to council end of August, beginning of September with our final report. So, Your Worship, members of council, that concludes our presentation of the service delivery review for the town of Cobourg. I would like to thank you once again for allowing us the opportunity to serve. And if there are any questions, more than happy to answer them at this time.
You just unmute, Your Worship.
Thank you, Oscar, for a most informative presentation. I'll take any questions of clarification from members of council. Starting with Councillor Chorley, then I'll go to Councillor Darling. Councillor Chorley.
Thank you, Mayor Henderson. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about whether this service delivery review will assess how accessible our services are, particularly to those with limited physical abilities.
Through you, Your Worship, one of the things that we will do is we will assess the degree of the town's compliance with the AODA, which is the legislation that overrides accessibility issues. I do want to caution, though, Councillor, that is basically the extent of it. So in terms of physical inspection of properties to determine access and barriers, to be honest, that's not within the scope of our review.
Councillor Darling.
Yes, again, thank you for the presentation. Just on your comparatives, I guess, having been in town for a number of years and seen these type of reports before, Collingwood was always in there. And I just, when I saw the list of comparatives, we've always been compared to Collingwood over the years. I'm just wondering if you have any information as why Collingwood wasn't in there.
Through you, Your Worship, I would suggest that Collingwood is larger from a comparator perspective. What I would also suggest, Councillor Darling, is Collingwood, my experience has been, has a very high level of service. And Collingwood has a high level of service because they have a quite prosperous community, if you will. And so because of that, what we often find is they are not a good comparator outside of the geographic areas. It's just they have an exceptionally high service level standard. Councillor, if you'd like, we're more than happy to put them into the mix. We've used them in the past when we did work in Midland and Wasaga Beach, for example. But what we'll find is they have a tendency to be an outlier, and what they'll actually do is they'll bring the average up.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering that because just traveling through Collingwood the past few years, they have really built up their area. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Oscar. That was an amazing presentation. I'm really excited to see this process evolve. My question is, at the conclusion of this service delivery review, the implementation you mentioned earlier, what will we get some kind of guidance as to how to implement your they won't be recommendations, there'll be opportunities. And the second question I had is, immediately following or shortly after this is approved by council, we will be embarking on an organizational review. Do you see the two as side by side, or do you see the two that would overlap one after the other?
Through you, Your Worship, and two questions, Deputy Mayor, so two responses. The approach to implementation, we have a suggested approach to change management that talks about establishing a transformation team, who's on it, what skill sets and resources do you require, how do you define change objectives, how do you monitor change processes and ultimately implement. So there will be that type of transition framework, recognizing that different opportunities will take different nuances from it. Sorry, I forgot your second question. With respect to the organizational review, Deputy Mayor, what I would suggest is this: there likely is some benefit in staggering it. And the reason why is because if you are going to make changes to services, if you believe that form follows function, what you really want to do is you want to land on your services first and then design the organization to deliver those services. Because what you'll sometimes find in these reviews, Council, is you'll find instances of what we call siloing. And I'm not saying that's the case here, but we've seen up to 4 different fleet functions inside a single municipality. One for public works, one for parks and recreation, one for transit, and one for fire services. And so what you have is you have 4 different fleet departments ostensibly working in the same organization. And then the question is that the most efficient way to do it? Or could you look at bringing those silos down? And once again, I'm not saying that that is happening in Cobourg. I have no reason to believe that. But if we do, then the organizational redesign component would actually be the implementation of that consolidation opportunity. So we intend to provide commentary to your CAO and staff with respect to organizational structure and organizational design. But once again, I would suggest it's probably important to let the service review go out first, because if you are going to make changes to how you deliver a service, if you're going to get into a shared service arrangement with the municipality, if you're going to establish a municipal service corporation, then what you may find is that your existing org structure needs to change already. So let the service review run its course.
Thank you.
Other questions, members of council? Back to Councillor Chorley.
Thank you, Mayor Henderson. My question was, well, first of all, I want to thank you for your explanation of how you chose the comparative municipalities. I think the rationale is really good, but I'm just wondering, how do you balance that with also keeping in mind provincial and national best practices, as opposed to just the standards set by other similar sized municipalities?
through you, your worship, what you'll find is determining service levels is actually a bit of a mix of functions. So I mentioned the Ontario Building Code. There's a requirement for building permits to be completed within 10 days. So that's a standard that's mandated at the provincial level. Under the Planning Act, there's a variety of planning applications that are required to be completed within 90 days. So that standard is set by provincial legislation. Now, what we'll find, Councillor, to your point, is if you're putting off building permits in 2 days and planning applications in 7 days, we then need to ask the question, why so fast? And is it because you have more staff than a typical municipality would have? Similarly, if we're finding that you're not hitting those marks at all, then the question is why, and maybe you need to enhance your resources. So in some cases, it will actually be determined by provincial standard, but what you'll find is for a raft of municipal services, there is no provincial standard, if you will. So for example, parks and recreation facilities. There's no standard that said thou shalt have X number of kilometers of trail per capita or X number of square feet of ice pad per capita. And that's where we get into the municipal best practice exercise. So to your question, Councillor Chorley, and I hope I'm answering this appropriately, what you're going to find is the definition of service level and what that standard is actually a mix. It's a mix between what legislation tells us it needs to be and a mix between what other municipalities actually put into play. And the best example that I will cite for you is winter roads maintenance. The province of Ontario has established a regulation that defines minimum maintenance standards for roads. They designate every road between a class 1 and a class 6, depending on traffic volumes and speed limit. And for each one of those roads, there's a standard. I have met very few municipalities that actually adhere to that standard. And the reason why is because they want to make sure that their school bus routes are clean. They want to make sure that their hills are down to bare pavement, even though the provincial standard would say, I don't need a bare pavement policy. And in those cases, Councillor Chorley, despite the fact that the ministry prescribes the standard, the actual standard is higher because that's the practical realities of shoveling snow. And so there'll be a mix, and through the process, we actually explain how we develop that standard. We challenge your staff on where that dot goes, and we do some analysis in the benchmarking to show what everybody else is doing as well. So it is a mix. Admittedly, there's a lot of different things to consider. In your question, you talked about provincial and national best practices. We will look at those comparator municipalities. I don't like going outside of Ontario because jurisdictional rules are different. I also don't like comparing you to the city of Toronto because the size just entails a different standard. So we will be looking for those differences. I hope that answers your question, Councillor.
Thank you. That's a great answer. I appreciate the explanation.
Oscar, to your comparable list, I have 1 or 2 names I'd like to suggest for your consideration. One that came to mind was Huntsville, because in population it's down as 19,816 and the area is 27.9 kilometers squared, which is close to Cobourg. And the other that came to my mind based on similar stats was Strathroy-Carterduck, although in Middlesex, 20,867 population with 77.1 kilometers. So I just shared that for your consideration. I don't know if that takes you too far out geographically, but I'll leave that with you.
No, and your worship, we're happy to add them. I just will caution, Huntsville is in the district of Muskoka. It is not in a county structure. And so what you will find is in the district, much like the regions, a lot of things are flipped. So for example, police, water, typically lower tier in county systems, in regions and districts, at the upper tier. Now that said, we can still use them for comparisons around parks and recreation, building permits, what have you. The other comment that I will make about Huntsville and the caution that you need is the district of Muskoka, the way they take care of district roads is they contract out the entire operation to the lower tiers.
Okay, well, that's great information that you have. I certainly wouldn't be at my disposal, which would be contrary to what we're doing.
Your worship, will add both to the mix. What you may find though is in the case of Huntsville, they may not be used as a comparator for specific services because of that county other one. In terms of Strathroy, Carnaduck, and I will apologize to their residents, until you told me they were in Middlesex County, I didn't know where they were. So thank you for the clarification.
Okay. Are there any other clarification from members of council? Seeing none, again, Oscar, we look forward to working with you and KPMG, and thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, your worship.
Mr. Larmer?
Yes, your worship. Next, there's no delegations, sewer general government services.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, your worship. Only one item this evening on general government services. A memo from the Municipal Clerk, Manager of Legislative Services, regarding the 2019 Freedom of Information FOI requests processed under the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The action recommended that council receive the 2019 Annual Freedom of Information Request Report under Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act from the Municipal Clerk, Manager of Legislative Services for information purposes. Any comments from any member of council? Seeing none, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Vote is carried. Thank you.
I believe in our agenda, we're down now to Parks and Recreation with Councillor Chorley.
Thank you, Mayor Henderson. So item 1 is notice of motion, Councillor Emily Chorley and Councillor Nicole Beatty regarding a flood mitigation and response plan. And the action recommended, whereas at the Committee of the Whole meeting on June 24th, 2019, the emergency planner informed council that a flood-specific response plan would be developed to help address the ongoing problem of flooding and erosion in the town of Cobourg. Therefore, council directs staff to draft a flood mitigation and response plan in consultation with the Ganaraska Region Conservation Authority, or the GRCA, and other relevant agencies for council's consideration as soon as possible and no later than September 14th, 2020. And for members of council, I'd just like to take a minute to explain why this is being brought forward. First of all, the GRCA has issued a flood watch to advise citizens that the potential for flooding is now considered high on Lake Ontario. So Lake Ontario water levels, it's my understanding, are currently about 23 centimeters higher than they were at this time last year. And we all know that Lake Ontario had record-breaking high water levels last year. It's my concern that we will face another record-breaking season. It is possible this year. Last year, I toured several properties, and I know other members of council did as well, to see the damage caused by flooding and erosion, and it was certainly substantial. And I want to reassure those residents that this council will do everything at our disposal to enhance our preparedness to any flooding emergency. In March, the provincial government released Ontario's new flooding strategy. And as part of this, it's my understanding that the province is considering making it mandatory for municipalities to conduct flood vulnerability studies and develop resiliency plans and enhanced emergency plans for vulnerable areas. So I think it's important that we get ahead of this requirement. I believe very strongly that the creation of a flood mitigation and response plan, one that is bespoke to the town of Cobourg, will help to build our resilience to high water levels going forward. And I think the time is right for council to see this through. And just to clarify, a flood plan is quite different than the sandbag policy council passed last week. So the policy actually established the level of service the municipality would provide with regards to sandbags, but a flood plan would be much more comprehensive and encompassing. So I found it quite helpful that the Ontario Ministry of the Solicitor General has created a guideline for the development of a municipal flood emergency plan And the aim is to provide a more coordinated response to any flooding emergencies. And they provide a list of the key points that any flood plan should contain. And I think it's a helpful list. It should explain the role of the Conservation Authority, in our case, the GRCA, the role of the Municipal Flood Coordinator, the identification of priority municipal services and procedures to sustain those services during a flood, the roles of other levels of government and external partners during flood preparation and response, and a description of the relationship between involved agencies. It should also outline procedures to be followed for the development and dissemination of emergency information and public education that is accurate and coordinated with all agencies. So this guideline was followed by the municipality of Clarington, and I've had a look at their flood plan, and they hit all of those key requirements. Now, notably, the GRCA does have a flood contingency plan, but it is primarily focused on identifying flood threats and alerting municipalities, not actually coordinating a response. So right up front in section 2.1 of the GRCA's plan, it clearly states municipalities have the primary responsibility and authority for response to flooding and flood emergencies, and also for the welfare of residents and protection of property. In order to fulfill this responsibility, municipalities should ensure that emergency plans are maintained and tested on a regular basis. And the Ontario government says that flooding is now the most costly and increasing natural hazard across the province. And we know that Plan 2014 is a factor in high water levels, but we also know that climate change is a factor in high water levels. So for me, this is about our municipality being nimble, being responsive, and being prepared to respond to a changing environment and establishing a more detailed plan to enhance our resilience to flooding and high water levels. And I would just mention, if there's anyone else who has any questions or comments, Councillor Beatty.
Thank you, Councillor Chorley, and thank you for articulating. I think you and I share mutual intentions as to why the town of Cobourg should have a dedicated community flood management plan as an annex to our already comprehensive general hazardous and emergency management plan, which is why I obviously supported your motion coming forward. And when we were having the discussion about the sandbagging policy at the last committee of the whole, followed by regular council, I appreciated the staff answering particular questions, and what I heard from this group was emergency management is a priority. However, it's a separate item outside of the sandbagging policy. So I'm looking forward to council's discussion on this. Similarly, what I've learned through as a board member on the GRCA, that emphasis on municipalities should be incorporating a flood emergency response into our municipal emergency planning. I think also being a waterfront community between the flood planning zone of Brighton to Ajax, and watching other municipalities starting to take the leadership and having this dedicated annex in their community emergency management plan. I think this is an opportunity for us to formalize that leadership. To your point, Councillor Chorley, specifically a section that is defining the responsibilities of those 4 respective levels, as well as I know I hear from a lot of citizens really wanting to understand what are those cooperation and the communication responsibilities, instead of, oh, it's the municipality's responsibility. No, it's the Conservation Authority's responsibility. And again, how all those levels fit into, we can't prevent flooding, but we can only reduce the impact on both our own assets and support homeowners in their roles and responsibilities to their property as well. And then just a closing comment. I know I was really looking forward to, and I applaud staff for taking the initiative for organizing what was to be held on March 21st, but obviously due to our reality, it was postponed. But I know the community, I think there's a lot of gratitude, was looking forward to our flood erosion mitigation symposium that was scheduled for March 21st. And if with this plan, if we have that coordinated document that can also be highlighted and help lead that discussion at a community-wide symposium as we head into the seasons post-COVID-19, whenever that may be, I think this is a good opportunity to activate the development of that plan, and so that when we do go forward with public education and public engagement on flood and erosion mitigation, that we, the town, also have that directing document to help inform that education engagement. So thank you for letting me have the time to make those comments.
Thank you, Councillor Chorley, for Councillor Beatty, for those comments. Sorry. Are there any other comments or questions from members of council? Councillor Burkett.
Have you had a discussion with the emergency planner in regards to this timeline, and given the current situation and the work that's going on with this pandemic?
Thank you, Councillor Burkett, for your question. It's a very good question. I have spoken with our emergency planner. I did run the date past her, the September target timeline. And I think it is worth mentioning that we obviously will need to be sensitive in terms of the delivery of this and what timelines are possible. Our emergency planner is very busy dealing with the COVID-19 current pandemic. And she also informed me that she is working on a project called a HIRA project, basically putting together risk assessments for the municipality, which is very important and may take priority in her workload and may need to come ahead of a flood plan. So I did run the September deadline past her, and I think as long as we are willing to be flexible, it's a reasonable deadline at this stage, knowing that the situation might change. Are there any other questions or comments from council? Councillor Burkett?
Sorry, just in regards to the HIRA, I know we were working on that prior to this COVID-19, and there was a lot of work being prepared, and unfortunately, due to the situation, it's kind of pushed that back a little bit, and I would just be cautious of us finishing that, because that ultimately outlines some of the high level key items that we should be really looking at for dedicated plans. So I think that this is good information to have, and I think it's a little premature prior to us finishing our HIRA to putting this task to the emergency planner due to the formula and whatnot that comes out of that. It will produce, maybe higher items that should be looked at.
Thank you for your comments, Councillor Burkett. Councillor Bureau.
I want to thank both Councillor Beatty and you, Councillor Chorley, for bringing this forward. We know last year, I too walked around looking at the floods and the damage it caused, plus the damage of our own marina. I think this is a good thing, and I think this is one of our, to me, a pretty high priority, and a high priority for a lot of people in Cobourg. So I'm going to support it.
Thank you for your comments, Councillor Bureau. Are there any other questions or comments from members of council? Deputy Mayor Sagan.
Thank you, Councillor Chorley, and I also wanted to applaud yourself and Councillor Beatty for bringing this forward. With your indicators that the water levels are already higher than they were last year, we saw the damage that was done, and to me, this is a very important aspect, being on a waterfront community and a lot of homeowners that live on the water. So I will definitely be supporting this. Thank you for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Sagan. Mayor Henderson.
Thank you, Councillor Chorley. I see both critically important, and I know we're working through the emergency management on HIRA, But since we've been on council, since I've been on council, we have a number of issues, but I know council is very aware, our number one issue for the town of Cobourg in first place remains flooding. So I would like to believe, as long as we can remain flexible, knowing we have minimal staff working on HIRA and the flood, as long as we can be flexible on that date that we're working on both, because I see both being critical, especially with the flooding issue. And of course, it's our number one concern in our own emergency management. So I do support, but I'm hoping that council will be open if the emergency planner comes back and indicates she may require a little bit more time.
Thank you for your comments, Mayor Henderson. Are there any other questions or comments from members of council? Seeing none, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? It's carried.
We're off to Arts, Culture, and Tourism Services, and that takes it again to Councillor Burrell.
Yes, memo from the Municipal Clerk, of Legislative Services regarding the Cobourg Farmers Market for COVID-19 pandemic. Action recommended that council receive the report from the Municipal Clerk, Manager of Legislative Services for the information purposes and as additional information for council's consideration related to the councillor notice of motion. Open for discussion. What I would like to do also is ask Mr. Larmer, Councillor Beatty.
I was aggressively waving, but I will wait until you finish your comments. My apologies.
I was going to ask Mr. Larmer if he would be able to, if he wanted anything to explain on his report or any clarifications, if anybody wants to hear.
Sure, I can if you want, through your chair, to members of council. So I thought it was applicable and hope necessary, and hope you appreciate it, to provide a little background information and some understanding regarding the farmers market. Every year, actually, coincidentally, this time we provide a report to council, as well as throughout the year. Right after we're done in December, we work with the farmers market to work on the next year, to work on agreements, any changes, any provisions they want to include, any different areas, how it went in the previous year. This year was no different, even amid COVID-19. The only difference would have been is that we couldn't meet physically to discuss the creation of this new contract and agreement. Additionally, what we did was we let them know that obviously things are changing in our reality right now, especially when it's related to municipal facilities, open spaces, other public property in regards to limitation of entering these areas and participating socially with the public and them, as well as other members of Cobourg and citizens. So we haven't heard anything, and then this notice of motion came forward from the councillors. So we just followed up with them, and this is indeed something that they're looking towards inputting and getting started up with no delay, and operating their season on May 2nd. On the staff report, I did two things. I did what I always previously do, which is the authorization of a bylaw to enter into an agreement and get this started. The reason why we do the bylaw is because under the Municipal Act, Section 113 allows us to regulate farmers market in the town of Cobourg, allows us to provide prescriptions around the operations and the time and the hours of when they can operate and where they can. This particular farmers market, we don't operate, they do through a farmers market association, and we just provide the area for them. Most recently in 2017, 2018, they occupied the space around the fountain. Even before that, when I come in, and this has really seemed to be a great place for people to gather socially, get their produce, and see entertainment and do those things. The second part of my report is regarding a recommendation that council consider, knowing that the farmers market is a local food process that people get, and they want to support their farmers and put it on their farm to table. That's very important to residents of Cobourg. It's been tradition in Cobourg forever. But with the current state and what the decisions we've made and council support is regarding the closure not the closure, but the limitation of social gatherings and the walkthrough of our parks and these gathering places. So what I recommend is that physical location of the farmers market be delayed, but the town work directly with the farmers market like we've done in the past, just an alternate service delivery method. Some of the things I just want to make aware of is that the local health unit has provided comment, but just comment through electronic email regarding this. One of the things that they have done is they've reached out to what's called SPHO, which is their Food Safety Committee. The interesting part and the significant difference of farmers market from regular businesses that sell food and prepare food is that they're regulated under a different act. They're actually the Health Promotion Act, and there's no regulation dealing directly with farmers market, and they don't need the requirements of passing in that regular restaurants would. There's just some different protocols around that, and this association, ASPHIO, created the best practices and a policy mandate. They actually are a committee too, and they sit. So Farmers Market Ontario, as well as this committee under the health unit, as well as our local health unit, met with farmers, as well as what's called a RECO market too, which is basically a model where a direct relationship between the farm producer and the actual customer will meet, like on a Facebook page, make an order, place an order, and get it delivered to them. Same way you would do physically, but a little bit different. So that's a different avenue. Somebody might have more information on that. I'm just learning about this stuff, so I'm just trying to interpretate it. But what's happening is that they're agreeing kind of in principle that during this COVID-19 crisis that they agree on an e-commerce model. So which is the delivery and buying of selling of goods and services over the internet. So to get away from a congregation of people. Currently through my desk this morning, I received an indication, which I haven't got to council, because we usually deal with this internally, but we'll provide additional information if you wish. But the farmers market currently is asking for the utilization of the Albert Street parking lot, which is in the notice of motion by the council member. But they're also proposing to have 27 vendors in there. We cannot support something like that currently with the social distancing measures and these purposes. They prevented a flow with it as well. So this is proving a little bit difficult as well. It's in the town of Cobourg too. The Albert Street lot currently is a lot for people to park in. A lot of the cars are staying there continuously due to the fact that they are actually in the condo residents and downtown residents, and they're self-isolating or they're staying home as well. So that would have to be another process. One of the other additions is that we've closed down our public washrooms too. So the need public washrooms and sanitation. So there's a number of things that we have to deal with prior to this happening. So the purpose of the recommendation, and a lot is in the report, is that I really think that we should help them and we should work with them. We'll take whatever council's direction is, but I think it's something that needs to be worked out first, and we can provide some options and work together on it. But currently, right now, you're seeing what I'm seeing. We haven't had that conversation yet. So the land that the farmers market operates on is Cobourg property. It's municipal property. You're entering a lease on that, so you're inviting people to come on that property. So there's a form of liabilities there too. We do have government orders of social gatherings of limited 5. There is some confusion maybe, and I don't think I have the answer for this either, but farmers market as an essential service. Farmers market themselves are not listed as an essential business service. It's actually, it was written in my report, agriculture and food production businesses are essential services. So they're actually location where they grow and they produce these are their actual, so the farmland or where they sell that or where the originating product is. Farmers markets is not an essential service. Again, there could be interpretation to this. For example, under the Act, it says that 113 that we do this. Well, if we do this and we operate and we control these and regulate them, then government's considered an essential service. So we allow it to happen. So there's a bunch of different arguments around this as well. But just based on everything we have in place right now in the town of Cobourg, staff's recommending that the physical location does not stop. It just gets delayed until we kind of navigate out of this process. And in the future, we can talk about this, but the town is willing to very much step up and help out as much as we can to the farmers market to help them deliver an e-commerce model or some other model that could limit the capacity and population of one area rather than inviting different people. I just also quick notice the area that they're proposing in the area that they currently occupy during the farmers market season, again, is a park space and is surrounded by residences. There's a number of condo residences there, all surrounding the area too. So we want to make sure that we're making everybody comfortable in the town of Cobourg. And even though they are occupying there and they understand that it's a park, those areas, I think we have to make sure we take everyone in account as well. So that's it, Councillor Bureau.
Thank you. Councillor Beatty?
Thank you, Councillor Bureau, and I'm glad that the clerk went before my question because he answered many of them. Thank you for clarifying, or through you, Chair, to the clerk, in your report in item number 6, because when I was doing some research around this, there's some press releases issued by Farmers Market Ontario dated April 7th, and justfood.ca released it saying that FMO had confirmed with the province that under that definition of agricultural resources that farmers market were indeed an essential service. But to your point, open to interpretation, and I support your statement there about the actual location where the foods are grown. I'm really glad to hear that you mentioned the RICO network. That was something I was going to bring forward if members of council haven't heard about this. RICO, which is inspired from the Scandinavia countries, but Nadia Simard, a farmer and local resident in our community, started up the Cobourg RICO network about a year ago, Northumberland wide, but then specifically focusing on Cobourg. It's an online group supported through a public Facebook group. Over 1,400 members for the Cobourg Circle. And they actually connect the shoppers, consumers, to local farmers. And actually, if members want to see it in action, they're actually doing their April curb to pickup in the Habitat parking lot this Wednesday from 5:45 to 6:45. Really neat way of how shoppers connect directly with markets, electronic payment processing, so it's directly consumer to farmer, and they set up in the parking lot on Division Street, and I've seen it set up and practicing social distancing and curb to side pickup. So Mr. Larmer, just maybe for your information, I know the organizer of the RICO network quite well, and so I'm happy to connect you with Nadia, but I do encourage council members and farmer market members, if they haven't yet, to go and see how this operation is set up in April, but more importantly, how they've adapted their parking lot pickup orders since COVID broke out since March. And I know when Nadia reached out to me asking, am I an essential service, I referred her to the health unit, and she has since has received the public health advice accordingly.
Thank you, Councillor Beatty. Councillor Darling, and then Councillor Burkett.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, are we going to have our full discussion here on this before we read the notice of motion, or read the notice of motion and then have our full discussion?
Well, I think, to me, I'm okay with going ahead and then moving forward to the notice of motion. Is that okay, Brent? Are we, sorry, Mr. Larmer, are we allowed to do that? Okay, Councillor Burkett, did you want to have anything to add, or did you want to wait till the notice of motion?
I can wait till the notice of motion. I think it's best that we receive this for information first.
Okay, motion on the floor to receive this as Mr. Larmer's report on the farmers market for information purposes. All in favor? Carried. So now we'll move on to the notice of motion. I did make an amendment to that. So, Mr. Larmer, does the motion that, yes, perfect. Thank you. All right. Whereas the Cobourg's Farmers Market has been an asset to Cobourg and its citizens for the years every Saturday morning from the first weekend in May to the last weekend in December before Christmas, and whereas the Cobourg's Farmers Market is a direct source to the residents of Cobourg by supplying quality produce from farm to table. And whereas the Cobourg Farmers Market is deemed an essential service by the province of Ontario by providing essential food to local residents. And whereas the Cobourg's Farmers Market would like to open the first weekend in May 2020 to sell the produce to the public with the utmost safety precautions. And whereas the list of safety precautions are as follows. 1, we intend to follow all the public safety protocols given to the Farmers Market Ontario from the Association of Supervisors of the Public Health Inspectors, ASPHIO, and our local public health unit. Number 2, we will provide a hand sanitizing station with signage informing people to maintain social distancing and what direction to proceed through the market. 3, only food be offered for sale to comply with Ontario's Essential Workplace Order. 4, all names of the vendors selling will be recorded and records will be maintained. 5, there will be no sampling of food. 6, there will be no reusable or customer supply containers. 7, there will be no communal tables or seating. 8, tents will be spaced apart and customer circulation will be monitored. 9, the only food that will be offered for sale will comply with Ontario's Essential Workplace Order. 10, we will incorporate an online ordering system so customers can pre-order and have the option to prepay before coming to the market, using the market as a pickup point. Whereas the Cobourg's Farmers Market needs a different setup other than the Oval and would like to utilize the parking lot directly east of the Oval for customer pickups and to ensure safety of all customers. Now therefore be resolved, the Cobourg's Farmers Market be able to continue the tradition of opening the first weekend in May with all safety measures that are outlined in this motion and the use of the parking lot east of the Oval until the pandemic is over and is safe to move back to the Oval. And further that, food vendors should respect the following measures to protect themselves as shoppers. 1, wash hands regularly through minimum 20 seconds with soap and water or use an alcohol-based sanitizer. 2, clean and sanitize frequently touched market stand surfaces regularly with household cleaners. 3, maintain social distancing, keeping 2 meters, 6 feet away from others. 4, avoid touching eyes, nose, and mouth. 5, cover mouth and nose with bent elbow or tissue if coughing or sneezing. And 6, not attend the market if not well. Prepackaged and products at fixed prices to reduce contact. I also want to say a few things. I do understand that it is open up to interpretation, but I did get an email from, I did ask David Piccini's office, MPP Piccini's, about the farmers market, and they have a whole protocol list for multi-vendors and multi-stand markets for food sales only, and which is outlined in the parameters in my notice of motion. I do have another question to Mr. Larmer, and then I'll open it up for discussion. Mr. Larmer, Council, we can tonight decide if Council chooses to set up in the, if they agreed on this motion or any amendments, to let them use municipal land for the farmers market, correct?
Yeah, whatever decision you make, council makes tonight, will go to regular council and then be voted on for approval. Yep. But I just want to be cautious that it should be, it should be considered the location and base what they're trying to do. I don't think staff is going to do anything not comply with council's decisions, but we want to make sure the safety of the public, if it's an issue, will come right back to council. But yeah, any decisions made here is final.
Okay, thank you. I'll open it up for discussion. I think Councillor Beatty.
Thank you, Councillor Bureau. I do have 3 questions about the content of your motion, so I'll just ask a question and pause, and then you can come back to me after
Sure.
Other council members have had a chance to ask a question. The first, just going in the order of the points, an online order system, having that up and running within the next 10 to 15 days from now to May 2nd. And I'm assuming having to be a unified online payment gateway to take orders and to process and then to cash out to the farmers. Can you give council any idea as to what type of online platform would that be? Are they looking for requests from the town in terms of technology? And then if they are going to be providing an online payment gateway, why the need for a physical shopping experience? Why can't they follow something like a RICO model where you pre-order and you're just showing up and doing either curbside pickup, or similarly to what Millstone is doing on Queen Street there, the bakery, they closed their shop. You drive up into a parking lot, you're given your name and a number, and they come out with your order and you've already paid. So it's a grab and go.
Correct. The farmers market hasn't indicated to me on how that online platform would work. They indicated that they would like to open with safety precautions, and that since they were deemed an essential service, just like a grocery store or anybody that sells produce or food, that they should be allowed to be open. So how that would work would be the parameters in the motion, and if they don't follow that, then they should be shut down. Basically, if they're not following safety protocols that's outlined in the motion, then they shouldn't be working. But since it'd be deemed by council, if it does pass, they would be able to operate. But I don't know how the online would work. And that is a good suggestion, and I will relay that back to them, however the decision goes tonight. Councillor Darling?
Yes, I am in support of them being able to sell their produce and whatnot. I agree with Councillor Beatty in that they should be able to get it to the people, you know, and then have them come and pick it up. I mean, I did some shopping today at Canadian Tire. It was the same thing. I had to go put in a phone order, pay for it in advance, and then my wife and I stayed in the vehicle, and they opened the tailgate of my truck and put it in, as they did with the vehicles in front of us. People would pop their trunk, they dropped the product in the trunk, and all been prepaid. As far as setting up the booths and whatnot, to set up 27 booths, it's going to take quite an area to keep a social distance, and then I think it's going to be awful difficult to monitor the 6-foot distance, and people, unless you're putting a big line up and people are going through from booth to booth and staying apart. I think it can be done as far as them getting their food from the farm to the consumer's table, and I hope we can support it in that way. Thank you.
A couple of points, and Mr. Larmer, if you can correct me if I'm wrong. Canadian Tire and I do believe Home Hardware were deemed in the last provincial cuts to essential services were deemed not essential. So you're allowed to do the, if you're not an essential service, you're allowed to do the phone in and pick up. So since it's on private property and not municipal property, Canadian Tire and other places like that, that's allowable. So we got to remember, I know that it's open to interpretation, but they're selling food, and this is a lot of the market is this is how they sell it, and this is their only means of selling it. Second, I'm not convinced that there's 27 specific food vendors. So there maybe I could be wrong. I would have to go back and check. But a lot of the farmers market, when it is up in full swing and running, a lot of them are artisans as well as crafters and many other things. So I'm not sure if there's exactly 24 food vendors or not. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's that many. So anybody else? Councillor Burkett?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of research and discussed some key things with staff, because my thought on this was, if there was a way for the municipality to help the market with some kind of online setup, and we could do something to help the businesses. So I inquired with Ron, and Ron advised me that it would, Ron Jeske.
Okay.
IT department, inquired with Ron about if the municipality could do such a thing. And he advised me there's a lot of security issues with it. And he advised me that that would be something that we would not be able to do. So then I asked him one step further and said, would we be able to put a platform or a landing page on the municipal website that outlined, what vendors there were, where you could contact them, get the information out to the public as a service to the public in that respect, but also help the vendors. And he said, yes, talk to Ashley Purdy. So I did talk to Ashley Purdy, and she said it could be something that we could implement as a landing page through the COVID or through our website. And she said there would be basically, as long as the vendors provided, whether it was, this is the kind of items we're selling, this is the information about us, this is how you can get in contact. Then that way we're at least providing something for the farmers market. And then maybe it goes as far as we can implement something where there's a pickup location, because I'm sure most people, the vendors could get the product to them, but say somebody wanted to meet up or whatever, we can maybe provide that piece. But that's kind of the my thought on it would be, if we provided some kind of resources like that. I was hoping we could do some kind of online thing to support them, but as Ron said, that would not be something we want to get into. But as him and Ashley confirmed to me, that we could provide a landing page with the information, and that I feel that's a good resource that we can provide and move in that direction. And I would concur with Councillor Beatty about that RICO network. I read it. There was an article in Cobourg Now about it, about how a lot of farmers are doing that. So that's something I think we just need to promote. These vendors are out there, and this is what they're selling.
Thank you, Councillor Burkett. I do know that council doesn't dive into operations that of anybody's business other than the towns. And I do think that is a great idea to have, to ask communications manager Ashley Purdy to, well, however this goes tonight, is to have some sort of information on the website. Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barreau. I am support in farmers market, its long-standing tradition in the town of Cobourg. However, I'm not in support of the vendors as proposed. It goes against everything we're doing in the pandemic. It goes everything against our town messaging of stay home, stay apart. When I looked at the stats for town of Cobourg, we know we're an older population. When I broke down the stats from the health unit, 35% of our population approximately are over the age of 65. In total, when I looked at the census in 2016, we have a little over 7,025 individuals in the town of Cobourg. And the last thing we want is for those individuals to be congregating in vendors with all the systems and complexities in place, especially when the pandemic time has been extended to May 12th. So anything that speaks against our provincial federal model, I will not be able to support. However, under the health guidelines, it does state a second scenario that perhaps through Mr. Larmer's department, they could work through yourself and with the farmers market to what could be done in e-commerce, very much to what Councillor Beatty has highlighted on the RICO that exists now in the town of Cobourg through Habitat for Humanity. I feel that's worth exploring, but to put this in place, regardless, the farmers market still has to get this plan approved by the health unit. They have to make the submission to the health unit. So in my opinion, where we are today, there's no way we're moving from now, potentially to an e-commerce, potentially to making this work for the farmers market, getting it approved by the health unit and have it operating by May 2nd. I would say that it would be highly impractical. So if your motion stands, because to me it's a combination of both, I will not be able to support it.
Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Bureau. I tend to agree with the mayor. I'm at the market pretty much every Saturday during the summer, and we don't really know how many people bring produce. And frankly, by the first opening market, nobody's growing anything yet. I mean, basically, May 24th weekend is the weekend we all plant our gardens. And I know that there's some mixed greens and there's some minimal amount of food by the 2nd of May, but most of the market vendors historically over the years have been craft and artisans because there's nothing growing yet. So I'm trying to picture the Albert Street parking lot with 27, because normally we don't know for sure. You mentioned you don't really know how many are food vendors, and that's a critical aspect to this decision. But normally all their trucks are parked in the Albert Street parking lot, and then they move, they upload, and then they go back to the Oval. So I think I would personally like to see more of a plan in place for e-commerce. And number one, number two, how many actual food vendors there are, and whether we could delay the opening till say the 1st of June, so we have more input from the health unit. We know exactly what we're looking at. And frankly, nobody will be growing much before then anyway. And I think we have to do this right. To the mayor's point, we have been staying indoors for 5-6 weeks now, and we don't want that all to go, because the market by its very nature is a very social area. And people may not get the fact that trucks are all lined up and you have to pick up and drop off. We've all been used to that with this COVID-19, but we need more information, I think, from the farmers market organization before. I personally love farmers markets, but we're not, it's not business as usual right now. And I think May 2nd might be, or is actually a little too premature to start doing what you're anticipating they will do. So maybe the end of June might, or the end of May, 1st of June might be more reasonable.
Councillor Beatty.
Thank you, Councillor Bureau, and I echo the mayor's and the deputy mayor's observations. I actually, Deputy Mayor, you raised a really good point about, you know, really we're not seeing full bloom on the produce or the fresh food side of things until that June warmer climate. Coming back to a question, Councillor Bureau, and then I wholeheartedly agree with you. You know, we don't have the purview to meddle in a partners association's operations. However, I think this is an exceptional time where more information as to what we are approving for the health of our community. As a councillor, I feel it is our responsibility to know more. In addition to not having enough information on online ordering systems, I really appreciate that they've talked about the cycle and following health advice about washing their hands and keeping clean, but there's no mention in your motion as to the details of that hand washing infrastructure. Is that a request of support from the town? And again, to the mayor's point, if that was, when, where, we wouldn't be able to turn the taps on, I can't imagine in the next 15 days. I don't want to get this into a discussion of the science, but there's no mention in the motion of offering PPE for markets. I know that we have almost a dozen of craftspeople and sewing groups making masks now for the general public in shopping. And so if I may, through you as the chair to the clerk, what I'm getting at is, my question is, given the information, Mr. Larmer, that you gave us in your report, can council give a direction to you as the clerk to connect with the farmers market, come up with a substantial strategy to a non-physical shopping experience that would allow e-commerce? I would even recommend the Cobourg Farmers Market to get in touch with the Market and S'more owners, who, although obviously are not a farm, but how they completely revolutionized their business. They moved all their ordering onto a simple site hosted by Shopify, which we're all familiar with. order every day, go a few days later, and again, curb to side pickup. So Mr. Larmer, can council give you the direction to connect with the farmers market to come back with a more detailed proposal, or perhaps it's an MOU for council to consider?
You, Chair, is it okay if I respond?
Absolutely.
You, Chair, to the member of council. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at in my report. That and that's part of the first part of it, is to direct us to do what we've done every year and work directly with them. Maybe it could be my fault or that, but unfortunately, I'm not sure why Farmers Market's not communicating with us, because we're really happy and we're excited to work with them to try to develop this new way of doing things until they can get back on their ground. I've reached out to parks, I've reached out to public works, I've reached out to community services and how we can help support them try to get this done. Because we know that it's basically a government, the province has done this, we've done these closures, restrictions on them. So now how can the government, or us locally, help them provide this service and get going and until we start again. So yes, I'm very, we were planning on really supporting them and working together and having this forward. A correction, it's 24, not 27 vendors of it, so I have 3 off. And I just want to be aware, we do a site visit with them. We haven't done that yet. So there's a lot of things to consider, and we would be happy to. And there's a lot of best practices out there as well, too. So we're really, really wishing that we can work with them.
All right, at this time, sorry, Councillor Beatty.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to acknowledge that you had a comment to make. Based on the response from the clerk, I do have a notice of a motion to amend that I'd like to put out, but
I was just about to.
Pardon me?
I was just about to do the same.
Okay.
So go ahead.
No.
Sure. No, go ahead if you have one.
Okay. It's the notice to amend is straightforward and open to additions from members of council. Is just to the motion to a recommended action is for council to direct staff to work with the Cobourg's Farmers Market to come up with a short-term alternative strategy for 2020 market operations to reflect the COVID-19 pandemic, with an emphasis on providing service through e-commerce and curbside pickup.
All right, any discussion? Councillor Chorley.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Councillor Bureau for bringing this forward and putting this on council's agenda, because I think it's really important that council discusses this and we have that community-wide conversation on this issue. My reaction to the notice of motion is just that I would love to be able to go to the farmers market right now. But as other members of council feel the same way, I feel it's a little bit premature. And we still have a provincial state of emergency. I see that that's being extended to May 12th. And if it were possible, as Councillor Beatty has put this amendment on the floor, my preference is for curbside pickup. I think there's a difference between curbside pickup and having a retail environment, which is essentially what a farmer's market would be. It's by its nature, it's a communal environment and a social environment. And at this stage, I think it's just a little bit inconsistent when, for example, I can't go to the park and kick a soccer ball with my son, but I could go to a farmer's market, which is quite a busy environment. At this stage, I don't think we're quite ready for that, but I'm hoping we will be very soon. So my suggestion was either that we would delay consideration of this notice of motion until our next committee of the whole on May 11th. But as Councillor Beatty has suggested a good amendment, I would be in favor of the amendment. And the other reason why I just wanted to mention quickly is because the emphasis still, we're hearing from the federal and provincial government, the emphasis is on citizens doing their weekly grocery shop, ideally once per week, and with one member of their household doing that shop. And it might work for smaller households to be able to do their weekly shop at a farmer's market, but for my household, for example, with 4 members, I wouldn't be able to do one weekly shop just at the farmer's market. I couldn't buy milk, I couldn't buy cleaning products. So at this stage, I'd be in favor of the curbside pickup model.
All right, any other discussion on Councillor Beatty's? Yes, Mayor Henderson?
Through you, Chair, Councillor, yourself, and Councillor Beatty, I'm supportive of your amendment. Knowing, I don't think you have to write this in, because anything that's done through the staff, anything that's done would still have to go for approval with the health unit to get their blessing. So knowing that's kind of inherently built in, I'm very supportive of the amendment, and I think it's a great compromise, as Councillor Chorley said, in this still challenging time.
Any other discussion? I do want to say that on in Mr. Larmer's report, there is a recommended action. I'm not sure if everybody's seen that, but it does have quite an extensive detail in that. But we'll vote on Councillor Beatty's motion first, or amendment. Councillor Burkett?
Could we just get Councillor Beatty to read the amendment one more time?
Yeah, I was just about to ask her to do that. Councillor Beatty?
One more time, okay. What I put together is the recommended action is that council directs staff to work with the Cobourg Farmers Market to come up with an alternative short-term service model for market operations to reflect the current social distancing and other public health measurements put in place as a result of COVID pandemic, with particular emphasis on e-commerce and weekly curbside pickup options only. And for this report to be due back to council on May 11th, if that timeline works for the clerk.
I do have one question to Mr. Larmer. That curbside pickup, that can't be on municipal property, correct?
So regular businesses like solicitation and exchange of goods and services wouldn't be able to. It's not allowed in the bylaw. But since Cobourg Farmers Market operates solely on municipal property, it would be fine. We just have to amend the agreement, and we'd have to do like a short-term agreement for the purpose. And we'd have to figure out what area we would actually allow them to do the curbside pickup. So we'll have a bunch of options to bring forward, and we'll work with them. We'll come to a final place, and then we'll bring that to council for approval.
So any other discussion? I'll call the vote. All in favor? Carried.
Mr. Larmer, I think we're on to unfinished business. To you.
Just to clarify, that was an amendment to the main motion, which replaced the wording.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe if the Council Bureau just calls the vote on the final one, it's the same thing, but just for the minutes.
So all in favor on the regular regular motion? And carried.
Thank you. Sorry.
No,
That's right,
fine.
Mr.
I get it.
Mr. Larmer, to front business.
Your worship, so the unfinished business is listed on the agenda. Is there any comments from council members?
Councillor Barol, starting with you.
I'm wondering on the status of the MOU with the art gallery, as well as the MOU with the library. Just wondering where they are on that.
Larmer.
I think that has to be directed to CAO.
Okay, Mr. Davey.
They're on the list, but to be honest, there hasn't been a lot done on them to this point.
Okay. Is there anything I could pass along on dates, times? I know we're in a situation right now. The art gallery's been, I believe, over a year, and I know the library is relatively new. Are we able, can I give kind of an end date when we possibly would be able to get for each?
Mr. Davey.
I honestly don't have an end date at this point, no.
Okay. Any other questions, members of council? Seeing none, thank you. We do not, I believe, Mr. Larmer, have anybody registered for the open forum. Is that correct?
Yeah, no one, I just rechecked it, nothing received before 6.
Okay, calling for adjournment. Councillor Burkett, all in favor? Thank you, everybody.